right.
Gee, look at all these people.
So let's get started. We are delighted to have with us Jeffrey Toobin, who is a writer for The New Yorker and a senior legal analyst at CNN. He has written several best-selling books about the law and the Supreme Court that have focused on the historical, political, and personal inner workings of the court. That includes The Nine, the inside world of the Supreme Court, and The Oath, the Supreme Court, or the Obama White House and the Supreme Court. And his next book is going to focus on the ongoing probe into Russian interference in the 2016 election, which is, I assume, why you were trolled by Don Jr. on Twitter last week.
Yes, with louder. Is your microphone on? I don't know if
it is.
Is it? All right. I'll explain why Don Jr. called me, with characteristic elegance, a scumbag yesterday. Anyway, so should I guess so? Why don't I stand up for a minute, okay? Hello, everyone. It's good to be here. Stanford, it's so fancy. It's so great. Wow, it's like, I'm not used to these cushy surroundings. Who likes beer? Everybody likes beer, right? Who knew that would be a laugh line? But it's been quite a week in the in my line of work. But it's been quite a year and a half in my line of work. We sort of view the Trump administration in dog years. He's been president, it seems, for about 13 years already, given the volume of news that has come out of the Trump White House, for better or for worse. I would mostly like this to be a sort of interactive dialogue with you. I don't have a big stem-winding speech here about the court. I'd just like to offer a few thoughts. Perhaps, I assume we will get to Kavanaugh in due course, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about the court as an institution and as a reflection of the current political moment. And as I think about the current Supreme Court, I think about the biggest political development of our lifetime, and that is the evolution of the Republican Party. The Republican Party of the 1950s, the 1960s, into the 70s, had a broad range of views, and moderate Republicans and liberal Republicans were a big, important constituency in the Republican Party, whether that was in the House of Representatives, in the United States Senate, or at the Supreme Court. And as if you think about the sort of last 50 years on the Supreme Court, for much of the history, much of that 50 years, moderate Republicans have held the balance of power in the court, whether going back to the 1950s with John Marshall Harlan, the 1960s and 70s with Potter Stewart, and then, of course, into the 1980s with, 70s, first Lewis Powell, then Sandra Day O'Connor, and, of course, Anthony Kennedy. And that part of the court, that part of the court has disappeared just as it has disappeared in the rest of the country. I mean, there is no moderate Republican Party anymore. John Boehner, who is not someone I am used to quoting very often, but he recently gave a talk where he says there's no such thing as a Republican Party anymore. There's just the Donald Trump Party. And that's true, but it is also true that the Republican Party has been changing a lot since the 1970s. I mean, if you look at what John Paul Stevens is someone who I left out. John Paul, the platform of the Republican Party in the 1970s called for gun control. Abortion was not part of the Republican platform until the 1980s. I mean, all of those changes have been evolving, and so the fact that we have Republican appointees on the Supreme Court who no longer include David Souter, Anthony Kennedy, Sandra Day O'Connor, John Paul Stevens. Instead, we have John Roberts, Samuel Alito, Clarence Thomas, Neil Gorsuch, and we'll see by the weekend who else is on the court. But that evolution is sort of how the court was set up. I mean, for better or for worse, that the court was designed to reflect. That's why the president gets to appoint. That's why the Senate gets to offer advice and consent. It's meant to reflect, in part, the political composition of the country at large. And we get the Supreme Court that we vote for on Election Day. Interestingly, and this may change, although I don't think it will very quickly, is that conservatives and Republicans have been much more in touch with the importance of the Supreme Court than Democrats and liberals have been. One of the clear messages of the 2016 election was that conservatives and evangelicals, for whom Donald Trump's personal life could not be more repellent or foreign, voted for him in overwhelming numbers and continue to support him to this day because of his appointment of Neil Gorsuch, his appointment of Brett Kavanaugh, and his appointment of many lower court judges who are similarly conservative. That kind of fixation on the court is something that the Democratic Party doesn't have. And one of the and this was really manifest, I think, in the 2016 election. And when I covered the Democratic Convention in Philadelphia in 2016, one of the things that really struck me was that Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, all the major speakers, not one of them even mentioned the fact that Merrick Garland was being held hostage. Now, putting aside the issue of whether Democrats would have had the gumption to hold up a nominee for 11 months, but the idea that Republicans were able to do that with political impunity, where it was just an issue that was essentially forgotten by the Democratic Party, is, I think, indicative of the differences in the approaches. Now, the incredibly high profile of the Kavanaugh nomination may change that, and I don't know I mean, nothing in politics is there for certain, but is around for forever. But I think it really is significant that Republicans have been so much more motivated by the Supreme Court, and they've gotten what they wanted. I mean, Neil Gorsuch is not with John Roberts and Samuel Alito. He's with Clarence Thomas. The first 15 votes he cast as a justice on the Supreme Court, Justice Gorsuch, the only justice he voted with in all 15 cases was Clarence Thomas. And I think that's what we're likely to see with Judge Kavanaugh if he gets confirmed, and it's likely to see with any Donald Trump nominee who gets confirmed, if any more are confirmed. And I think we should be very clear-eyed about what that means for the law. It means that Roe v. Wade is going to be overturned. It's not a question of if, and people try to sound sophisticated and say, well, they won't really overturn Roe v. Wade, they'll just limit it. No, they're going to overturn Roe v. Wade, in part because of its enormous symbolic importance, but also because of just the way the law develops. There are many states, which I've said openly, Mississippi, South Dakota, among others, that when the composition of the court changes, they will not do what states have been doing in establishing all these barriers to abortion. They will simply ban it and challenge the courts to overturn those bans. And the courts will, I am convinced, the Supreme Court will uphold those bans. And you can't uphold an outright ban on abortion in a state without overturning Roe v. Wade. I don't think you can do the legal gymnastics any other way. And so I think that is, the situation we face. But that's really only the beginning. Affirmative action, gone, out the door. Any sort of racial preferences, colorblind constitution, that will all be declared unconstitutional. Gay rights. Now, I don't think same-sex marriage is going to be overturned. That seems to have rooted itself in public life, and it has not become the political flashpoint that it once was. But I think the Masterpiece Bakery case is very much a sign of things to come. One of the great goals of the evangelical movement, there's sort of been two parts to it. One is to excuse religious people from obligations imposed on everyone else. The Hobby Lobby case was like that. They didn't have to pay for certain forms of birth control. And their First Amendment rights means they don't have to bake a wedding cake for a same-sex couple in Colorado. But the reasoning behind that is going to apply to a broader and broader groups of businesses, because the creativity of baking a cake, the briefs in the Masterpiece Bakery case were the only Supreme Court briefs I've ever read that dealt extensively with the question of icing. But they did, and they just talk about, you can't force an artist to use icing in a way that he doesn't want to, but that reasoning will apply to someone who has an in. My in is an expression of my creativity, and if I don't want to use it, to sanction a gay couple, I don't have to do it. Same thing with a restaurant. It's my creativity. My food is artistry, and I have a religious objection to gay people to coming to my restaurant. That's where we're headed in that department. The other place, the sort of parallel to that is, religious, and this is a big project of Betsy DeVos, the Secretary of Education, which is to get money into religious institutions. There was a case last year or the year before about paving doing a driveway or a playground. Was it the one?
It was a playground.
A playground in Missouri, where all the other schools got playgrounds. The religious schools should get a playground too. So that the idea that religious institutions could get their hands on more taxpayer money. That's another area that we're coming. Clarence Thomas has been agitating for years to expand the Heller decision in terms of the Second Amendment. One of the curious aspects of the Supreme Court's Heller jurisprudence is that there were two cases in quick succession, the Heller case and then the case from Chicago, where they said, states, localities couldn't ban the possession of handguns in the home. And then they basically stopped doing Second Amendment cases. Well, I think they're going to start doing more, and they're going to expand the constitutional prohibitions on gun control to include, more guns, bigger guns, hidden, concealed carry, all of that is coming. And I have so much more good news to come. I think that's sort of where I think things stand and where they're where the court is heading. And at that point, I'd like to just why don't we have a conversation a little bit and then invite all these smart folks to...
So I think what we're going to do is I'll ask a few questions, and then we'd love to have some questions for the audience. I don't know, Jason, are there mics that we can pass around? So there are two mics up here, and if people have questions, you can raise your hands, and I'm happy to take a mic to you, or Jason can help.
You have to speak into the mic because there's an overflow room. I'm so flattered. There's an overflow room.
So a lot to think about, or perhaps tear your hair about, just depending on your views. I had a few questions about the confirmation process. So you've obviously studied the justices, and they go through the confirmation process, and they get up to the court. Do you have any thoughts about whether the confirmation process that a justice goes through, does that affect their views on the court or how they conduct themselves?
Well, the one thing they all have in common is they all absolutely hate the confirmation process, and they all feel that they were uniquely aggrieved and treated horribly. And even though the confirmation process for all but Clarence Thomas has largely been forgotten, that one people remember, as you may recall. And I think I really think it actually does not have a big impact, other than a sort of unpleasant memory. They're used to being treated with a certain amount of deference. It's also true that, the confirmation process has become so much more contentious than it was. It is so hard to believe, but it is true that, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the former head of the Women's Rights Project at the ACLU, someone whose political views could scarcely be more obvious, was confirmed with more than 90 votes at the Supreme Court. And that, I think, is indicative of how there was, there has been ebb and flow over the years. Byron White, when he was appointed to the court in 1962, his confirmation hearing lasted 8 minutes. And they asked him, what's the job of the Supreme Court? And he said, to decide cases. And they all thought that was great. And they did. And he was confirmed. But when Richard Nixon nominated Clement Haynsworth, and who was actually a very distinguished judge on the Fourth Circuit, there was kind of a manufactured ethics controversy involving him, and he was voted down by a Democratic Senate in 1970. And Nixon wanted to punish the liberals by appointing someone who was really conservative and really unqualified, G. Harold Carswell, who was a judge on the Fifth Circuit at the time, who was really a horrible racist. And Birch Bayh, senator from Indiana, managed to get him defeated as well. And Nixon sort of surrendered and nominated Harry Blackmun, yet another moderate Republican who had enormous influence at the court for many years. Of course, the author 3 years later of Roe v. Wade. And then there was a period of relatively little controversy. Sandra Day O'Connor, I think, was confirmed virtually unanimously. Antonin Scalia, virtually unanimously. But then the next year was Robert Bork, 1987. And that was a confirmation hearing where Bork really engaged with the senators and answered their questions about his views, a mistake that no subsequent nominee has made. And he was voted down 58-42. Now, one constant of the Supreme Court confirmation process is that the only chance for defeating a nominee, historically at least, has been when the opposition party controls the Senate. Haynsworth and Carswell were Democratic Senate. Bork was a Democratic Senate. Thomas, which was a 52-48 vote, was a Democratic Senate. They passed him. And now we have a Republican Senate, and it's obviously, it's a close call, but the only reason Kavanaugh has any chance at all is because it's a Republican Senate. So in terms of, to answer your question, which is does it affect the justices? I don't think it does, except Clarence Thomas. Clarence Thomas has been embittered by this process for years. His anger was and is, I think, profound. His resentment of Democrats of the Senate is enduring. But I think he's the only one where you can draw any sort of line from his current views to the confirmation process.
So 2 other quick follow-ups just based on what you said. So you mentioned that we all remember, haven't forgotten, the Thomas hearings.
Well, most law students were born about 6 years after the Clarence Thomas hearing, so I doubt they remember it very well.
Well, but this is part of the question, because after Justice Kavanaugh's hearing on Thursday, or Judge Kavanaugh's hearing on Thursday, some people wondered whether the institution of the court would be damaged, given that he came out swinging against the left and the Democrats, and that this was revenge on behalf of the Clintons. But we've heard these kind of predictions. Well,
that one was so out of the blue. I'm
not answering that.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
But my question is, like, we've heard these predictions before, right? After Bush versus Gore, is the institution of the court going to be damaged? After the Thomas hearings, which, you know, a lot of people remember, was the institution of the court going to be damaged? Is it really true that 5 to 10 years from now, if Justice Kavanaugh is on the court, anyone is going to be talking or thinking about the court differently because the Senate confirmed someone who railed against the left?
One of my favorite justices was Robert Jackson, the best writer who ever, prose stylist who ever served on the court. He was appointed by Roosevelt. He served in the 40s and 50s, and he had a statement in a concurring opinion, which I consider one of the defining pieces of wisdom about the Supreme Court. He said, "We are not final because we are infallible. We are infallible because we are final." It's like, you know, you can like us, you can dislike us, but we're going to, you know, ever since Marbury versus Madison, 1803, they've had the last word. And, you know, these predictions that the court will be diminished in importance, will be, like, discredited, you know, I don't really buy it. I think, you know, a lot, you know, one thing we know for sure is that, you know, when you know, wake most Americans up in the middle of the night and you say Clarence Thomas, the first thing they say is Anita Hill. I mean, that's the, you know, synaptic link. And the synaptic link for, you know, Brett Kavanaugh will either be beer or maybe, you know, students will learn to recite his entire yearbook entry in you know, all, you know, is it Devil's Triangle and the whole thing and the Booth and the 100 Keg Club and all those distinguished groups he was part of. But you know, so I think, you know, one thing for sure is that Brett Kavanaugh's public persona will be, you know, is set in stone. But you know what? So what? If he's confirmed, you know what they're going to call him? Justice Kavanaugh. And you know, you clerked there, Professor Fisher clerked there. They're nice to each other. You know, they recognize that they are stuck with each other for decades. And there is an institutional comedy, civility. It's not like the United States Senate. They don't, God knows it's not like the House.
It's like arranged marriage without divorce.
Well, that's right. It's like an arranged marriage without divorce. And, you know, there is this tremendous premium on their being civil to each other. I mean, this is actually, I mean, when I wrote the Nine, one of the things that, you know, this was before your time on the court. Rehnquist, you know, under Warren Burger, where Rehnquist was an associate justice, you know, there was a lot of interaction among the justices. And basically it was a disaster. They found out they didn't like each other very much. And Rehnquist, when he became Chief Justice, he basically said, good fences make good neighbors. And he turned the conference, you know, the holy meeting on Fridays when they sort of hash out their views of the cases. Basically, under Rehnquist, it's like they went around the table and they voted. And you know, Scalia wanted to talk about the cases, and Rehnquist would, like, shut him up. He's like, you know what? We're going to disagree, but let's just sort of disagree and move along. And I, from what I understand, the conference is somewhat more expansive under Chief Justice Roberts, but it's still, you know, they just don't want to get in each other's faces too much. And I'm sure that will be the case with Kavanaugh. He's a smart person. They all know him. He's been on the D.C. circuit for a long time. I mean, they travel in the same circles. So, you know, and he's obviously a competent person. He's been a judge for a long time. He knows how to, like, write an opinion. He'll be fine. The rest of us, who knows? But he'll be fine.
So do people have questions that, I don't know how we're going to do the microphones.
Do we have several microphones or just one?
Oh, right here. Okay.
So I'm curious of your view of, now that all this left-wing ranting has come out, if Kavanaugh gets confirmed, is there any precedence for mandatory recusal? Is there any, does Roberts have any say over it? Walk us through
Well,
that.
one of the curiosities about the Supreme Court is that the code of ethics that is binding on federal district judges and federal circuit court judges is not binding on Supreme Court justices. There is no code of ethics. It is the honor system, and that covers recusal as well. In certain circles, you can't say anything bad about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But Ruth Bader Ginsburg talked trash about Donald Trump that was every bit as bad as what Brett Kavanaugh did. I mean, she said, well, I think I might move to New Zealand if he gets elected. It was wildly inappropriate. And she didn't get, she got some grief, but she hasn't recused herself in cases involving the Trump administration. I certainly think that what Kavanaugh said was wildly inappropriate, in conflict with how judges are supposed to behave, could be grounds for recusal in certain cases. If Hillary Clinton files a case for revenge, for example, he will probably have to recuse himself from that case. But I actually don't think he will have to recuse himself from that much. I mean, remember, I think this was a good thing. One of my favorite facts about the Supreme Court is that the court that once Alito left, once O'Connor was replaced by Alito, all 9 justices were former federal appeals court judges. Then Kagan came in. She was not an appeals court judge, but she was kind of like one. But the court that decided Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, not one of the justices had ever been a judge before. Think about that. Earl Warren was governor of California. Hugo Black was a senator. William Douglas was head of the SEC. Felix Frankfurter was a law professor. They had big, complicated lives where they expressed opinions on all sorts of things. And I think it's actually too bad that we don't have people like that on the court. So this whole recusal thing, that's like the least of my problems with Brett Kavanaugh.
Questions on that side? I can ask a question while we're waiting,
Sure.
Which is, you mentioned that the confirmation process doesn't actually affect the individual justices. Any chances it affects the broader court? So let's imagine, for example, that Justice Kavanaugh starts his new job on Monday, and then at the next conference, the justices are looking at a bunch of cases involving affirmative action, abortion, guns, and the whole slew. Do you think there's any chance that in light of the confirmation hearings, the court moves a little bit slower than it perhaps might have, or is it just open season?
I think John Roberts, in particular, is a very astute politician, and I don't say that as criticism. I think he recognizes, the title in the Constitution is not Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The title is Chief Justice of the United States, and I think Roberts takes that seriously. That he is sort of the embodiment of the judicial branch of government. And, I think he sees himself as the curator of the reputation of the court to the extent he can. He recognizes he only has 1 vote out of 9. But, he does not relish the court being in the center of the political fray. Given his druthers, I don't think he would like to see, a case challenging Roe v. Wade, in the next 6 months. He probably wouldn't like, he wouldn't like it ever, but I think he recognizes that it's probably inevitable. And there is a history at the court, and I think this is not a bad thing, of sort of denying cert sometimes in cases that are particularly hot button, waiting for other cases to come along. I think they handled, for example, the issue of same-sex marriage this way in a very sensitive, frankly, intelligent way. They, remember there was the Proposition 8 case that came out of California here that they, got rid of on incomprehensible procedural grounds that I certainly couldn't tell you what it was, but they basically ducked the issue as the country got more comfortable with the issue of same-sex marriage. And I think, Obergefell came at a time, the case that said same-sex marriage in all 50 states, where the reception was a lot different than it would have been a couple years earlier. And I don't blame the court for doing that. Whether it's Kavanaugh in particular that leads to, caution, I don't think I can read their minds that well. But, they for the most part, don't love political fights. And to the extent they can stay out of it, they'd prefer to. Yes. Someone over here?
Yeah.
Firstly, I wanted to say thank you for coming. Secondly, assuming Kavanaugh gets confirmed and Democrats take over the House, I wanted to see what you think the chances of impeachment for him would be and how likely it would be.
It's not zero. It's not zero. I just did a big piece in the New Yorker, I don't know, I guess 2 months ago maybe, about impeachment. It did not deal with the question of Brett Kavanaugh's impeachment. I'm not that good. And I think Democrats are, they are very wary of the issue of the '98 impeachment of Bill Clinton and how that pursuit basically damaged the Republican Party because it was futile from day one. And it just seemed like a political enterprise that didn't help anybody. So I think Nancy Pelosi, assuming she's Speaker, Jerry Nadler, who will be the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, they are not going to move to impeach Donald Trump anytime soon. I mean, they really are not going to do that. They will do investigations. I think after today and the big story in the New York Times, the odds that they subpoena his tax returns are very good. But an actual impeachment movement for Trump is not going to happen before the 2020 elections. However, I think the Kavanaugh story is somewhat different. I mean, I think given the incredible uncertainty surrounding his nomination, the severity of the accusations against him, what appears to be a pretty half-assed investigation by the FBI that appears to be over like today, that there will be at least some inquiry in that regard is not out of the question. The thing to keep in mind, though, is anytime you talk about impeachment, you are not just talking about a majority in the House of Representatives. You're talking about 67 votes in the Senate. Now, presumably, if Judge Kavanaugh Saturday or Tuesday, whenever the vote may be, gets 51 votes for confirmation, there are not going to be 67 votes to impeach him 6 months later. So barring any sensational disclosures, I don't think there is any realistic possibility of impeachment. But I think, the Democratic base would be would not object or would encourage impeachment in that direction, which is politically less incendiary than impeachment of the president. Why don't you give the mic? I don't mean to be a television director. Why don't we give it to the next person so that we can, anyway.
Yeah.
Thank you for that sobering overview of what's going to happen to us in the month to come and years to come. But I wanted to see what you realistically see as a way forward, and thinking about Madeleine Albright's point around the rise of fascism, and how do you see us, staying away from that kind of direction?
First of all, I'm just a journalist, so I don't have a program of change for you. I'm trying to get through Thursday. I'm not so worried about fascism, to tell you the truth. I mean, one of the lessons of the Trump era is, I guess it's already an era, is that it is the strength and resilience of other institutions. The press. I think the press has done a great job. I'm very proud to be a member of the news media. I mean, I think we've done it. I think we've done a good job. I think educational institutions are a very important part of, and when you look at issues like immigration, the role that universities have played trying to protect their students. That also applies to religious institutions, which have also taken, significant roles when it comes to immigration. The courts. I mean, I as you can tell, I'm not a super big fan of the current Supreme Court, but the courts have been a check, particularly the lower courts, on remember, the Muslim ban that was eventually approved by the Supreme Court was the third version. And it was considerably dialed back in its horrendousness from the original version that was struck down repeatedly by the courts. So, I don't think we're on the precipice of fascism, but, that's not to say it's not a serious time as well.
Well, we take a question from the back.
Yeah.
Can you shout it really loud?
I'll repeat it so that people in my beloved overflow room will be able to hear.
If the Mueller investigation or some other means results in delegitimizing your Trump's election, could that enforce the argument that the judges who serve as a result of his nomination and the justices who serve as a result of his nomination should have their lifelong position subject to invalidation or re-review?
The question is, if the Mueller investigation shows that Donald Trump was elected illegitimately, let's say, does that mean that the judges he appointed and nominated should have their positions somehow reviewed or taken away or impeached? Or no, I mean, it ain't gonna happen. I mean, you may not like the fact that they were appointed. I expect there are plenty of people in this room who think, but that's just not how the system is set up. I mean, just not going to happen.
Other questions?
Where we are today has been the stated goal of the Federalist Society for 25 years, and they seem to have accomplished it. Why are the Democrats so unable to be forceful and stick up for what they really believe in?
Well, the story of the Federalist Society is really fascinating, and I've written a lot about it in books. I wrote a piece about Leonard Leo when Gorsuch was nominated. Leonard Leo is executive vice president of the Federalist Society, who was basically the creator of the list of potential Supreme Court nominees from whom Gorsuch and Kavanaugh ultimately were chosen. There is the American Constitution Society, which is the liberal counterpart, which is just a good and successful organization. But I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier about the difference in motivations in terms of the political parties. I mean, you had literally millions of people who voted for Donald Trump who said to themselves or out loud, well, he's a buffoon, he's an immoral guy, but he's going to appoint our kinds of judges to the Supreme Court and to the lower courts. You don't have a parallel interest in the Democratic side. You don't have a lobby that now maybe if Roe v. Wade is overturned, it will create such a lobby, but. And there's also the question of money, that there's a lot of money for the Federalist Society from the Koch brothers and others. It's been very lavishly funded, but I don't think that's the only reason. I mean, I really do think the grassroots of the Republican Party care a lot more about constitutional issues than the grassroots of the Democratic Party. Oh, and I left out Citizens United. That's another thing. I mean, that's going to get much bigger. The deregulation of American politics, the idea that any sort of restriction on campaign finance, whether it's on the spending side or the contribution side, is unconstitutional. That idea is coming. And two more, actually. I'm sorry. I would just sort of throw it out there. Two things that don't get as much public attention. I mean, we certainly don't talk about that on CNN, but. And this is a big Kavanaugh priority. Kavanaugh is not a social justice warrior. I mean, that's not his thing. But his thing is shrinking the regulatory state. His thing is limiting what government can do. And there are two areas that I think people should think about. One is, the so-called Chevron deference argument, which is Chevron was a case about whether administrative agencies, how much they can regulate as authorized by law. Then Congress passes a law, and then the EPA regulates under that law. Kavanaugh, among other conservatives, has basically said, we want to narrowly confine the administrative agencies to what the law specifically authorizes. And what that means is fewer rules about pollution, fewer rules about food safety, fewer rules about any kind of regulation. And I think that Chevron deference. And the other came up particularly at the end of last term, which is the First Amendment, and what Elena Kagan in a dissent called the weaponization of the First Amendment. It came up in the context of this case involving public employee labor unions here in California, where the court said, forcing people to contribute certain money was a violation of their First Amendment rights. Well, you are going to see more and more arguments that corporations being forced to do anything violates their First Amendment rights, their right to speak, their right to express themselves. And that, I think, is going to be an area, again, limiting the ability of government to regulate private corporations.
I think we had some questions back there.
Thanks so much for being here. My question, which you touched on really tangentially before, is on nationwide injunctions.
It's on what, I'm sorry?
Nationwide injunctions. And
I don't think I touched on it even tangentially, but I'm happy to
you mentioned lower court
pretend that I'm an expert.
Mentioned lower court judges.
I'm on
in the
cable,
travel.
man. I could be an expert on anything.
All right, well, here we go. The question is sort of what effect do you think nationwide injunctions have had, good or bad, on sort of the court's own jurisprudence and the percolation of cases to the court? And then sort of looking forward, could we expect the Supreme Court to ban nationwide injunctions, and would that be a good thing or a bad thing in your eyes?
Well, I admit, I didn't even take federal courts in law school, so I'm like this is not like a big field of my expertise. But I remember being surprised when some right-wing judge down in like Brownsville, Texas, decides that all the Dreamers are going back. It was, issued a nationwide injunction against the President Obama's executive order, and that was upheld by the 5th, 11th, I forget which one of the circuit, and then I guess it was upheld, what happened?
For equally divided, 4-4.
Oh, it was 4-4, right. And then, fast forward to the Trump administration, you have all these liberal district court judges enjoining the Muslim ban nationwide.
Fair number of Republican-appointed ones, too.
Fair number of Republican-appointed, but nationwide injunctions nonetheless. I don't know. It depends whether you like the injunction, right? It's like, hey, the liberals thought it was great when it was the Muslim ban. I find it hard to believe that John Roberts, who believes nothing more than there should be orderly processes in the courts, will step in at some level and stop this, or at least limit it in some way. And I don't know exactly how it will be done, but I do think. What do you think? You know more about this than I do.
There's actually a bill in the House right now that was just reported out of committee to ban nationwide injunctions, perhaps except for some limited exceptions. There's some possibility this gets dealt with legislatively. The Department of Justice has also been trying to get the nationwide injunction issue up to the court through the lens of the sanctuary city policies, because district courts have issued nationwide injunctions prohibiting the administration from enforcing their order that maybe withdraws some amount of funding from jurisdictions it designates as sanctuary cities. And I think the administration views that vehicle as an attractive vehicle for demonstrating why nationwide injunctions aren't often necessary, because you can just enjoin it as particular jurisdictions. And I think that they recently sought a stay in the court at the same time that they sought a stay in the Seventh Circuit, again, challenging this nationwide injunction point, and the Seventh Circuit ultimately granted them a stay or a modified one. But I think that there's a non-zero chance that that's how it gets to the court, and it is difficult for me to see that there aren't 5 votes, assuming that there is a ninth justice confirmed in the next however many weeks or months, for the proposition that nationwide injunctions should be limited, except for some circumstances that we won't really have defined.
Right, that's what I think.
Just another in the back. Do you mind?
Do you think with what your prognosis is on the future that within those 2 years, with the changing demographics and where you think the country is going to go,
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Is that?
it seems like there's a diametric shift that will happen, and with an economic downturn,
The question is, do I think we're in for a period of social unrest given the demographic changes and the political polarization? To use the 3 words you're never allowed to say on cable news, I don't know. I really don't know. And again, I don't want to extend my expertise beyond its already significant limits. I don't know. I think you could make an argument that we're in for some periods of social unrest. I think if Donald Trump got reelected, I think you might see some real anger. But when you look at what the resistance, capital R, has been to Donald Trump, it has been some very big marches and a lot of women running for office. I would not call that social unrest. I would call that intelligent response. I would call that the system working as it's supposed to work. And so I don't think we have seen any signs of social unrest in an untoward way, which seems to be the basis of your question. Whether it will continue in that vein or get uglier, let's see how the elections turn out. I don't know.
Deborah?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Do you think it would be possible to impose term limits on these justices, and how would that happen?
Impose term limits on the Supreme Court. One of my favorite subjects. There is a wonderful proposal by a group of law professors, I believe, to impose basically 2 18-year terms. That each president would get 2 18-year appointments, and it would turn out, every president would get 2. It's a great idea. I'm totally for it. It's never going to happen in a million years. To change life tenure on the Supreme Court or any of the federal courts, you'd have to amend the Constitution, which fortunately is very difficult to do, through Congress, the state legislatures, and the party in power. There's always going to be one party in power, right? It's either going to be Democrats or Republicans, and that party is going to say, "The hell with limiting, lifetime tenure. I want to appoint, recent law school graduates so they can serve for 60 years." And that's sort of where we're heading. The Constitution was enacted in the late 18th century when people were expected to come into a certain level of prominence in their careers in their 30s and die in their 50s, right? That's like what people did in the 18th century. And so there was no expectation that routinely we'd have 30-year tenures on the Supreme Court, although John Marshall served for more than 30 years, the 4th Chief Justice. But the whole longevity issue. We don't want, by and large, people to serve 30 years. We don't want, Ruth Ginsburg is 85 years old. 85 is not the new anything. She's really old. And there's the only reason she's staying is because she doesn't want Trump to appoint her successor, and I certainly can understand that. But that's just generally not a healthy way to organize a polity. And I think it would be a better. Stephen Breyer gets asked this question, and he has an interesting response. He says, "Well, I have no objection to mandatory retirement or term limits as long as you make sure that the Supreme Court is your last job, that people should not be Supreme Court justices angling to do something else. And I think that's I hadn't thought of that. I think that's an interesting point. And like this, the 18-year terms, I think it's a great idea. I'm all for it. As I say, never happened.
Deborah?
Yeah. Jeffrey, I know you've been thoroughly thanked, but as the director of the Center on the Legal Profession, I have some sense of how challenging your schedule is right now. And I'm sure you must have had concerns that there wouldn't be much to talk about here at Stanford. So we're particularly grateful that you kept this event on your schedule. I wanted to ask just briefly about judicial temperament. And
what brings that up?
Arrogance, rudeness, belligerence, and the way he cut off the Democratic senators, which was breathtaking. If he couldn't hold it in for an hour on national television with his whole future at stake, what kind of message does that send to the world about, who we want to be on the highest court in the land?
Beats the hell out of me. One of my complaints about being a journalist sometimes is things seem sort of canned and planned out, and you sort of know how things are going to turn out. Well, that certainly wasn't the problem last week. I was so flabbergasted by Kavanaugh's performance. But I think, again, you have to put it in its political context and recognize, where we are in the. He gave that Fox News interview, which President Trump, let it be known he thought was bad and weak, which is like the big Donald Trump insult. And so, recognizing how important Trump is, not just in and of himself, but as, the person who sets the tone and sets the agenda for the Republican Party, I don't think there's any doubt in the world that Kavanaugh set out last Thursday to prove to the president that I'm like a kick-ass guy like you are. And it worked. Let's remember, it worked. To get 51 votes. That's what his job was up there. And I remember at CNN when we were doing wall-to-wall coverage, of course, and after Dr. Ford testified, oh wow, she's like here. It just occurred to me, not like here, unless she is. I don't know, but people were like in shock. It's like, what could he possibly say? His nomination's dead in the water. To give you an idea, they were saying that on Fox News, which is like, they never say stuff like that on Fox News. And then he comes out there and he creates himself as sort of the judicial equivalent of Donald Trump. And that's what they want. That's what the Republicans wanted. And that's what I found it shocking. Whatever we've all suffered. At least I have. I don't subject all of you. I'd suffered through a lot of congressional hearings. The one thing everyone does is treat the members of Congress with a certain degree of deference. And to be interrupting them with questions about their drinking habits, it was unbelievable. It was unbelievable. And I don't think you can separate out the gender politics out of all this. I wish I were the person who thought of this, but I certainly embrace it. Can you picture a woman who would have behaved like that? And if she had, they would have thrown a net over her and pulled her right out of the room. The different expectations that we have for how women behave in public and how men. And he was tough, and he was he was in charge, and he was putting the senators in his place. And a woman, the official adjective to describe women that is never used to describe men is shrill. I've never heard a man described as shrill, but women are described as shrill all the time. And that would have been the definition of shrillness. This is where our politics are. I just think never saw it. I know the current justices well enough to know that in particular would have really appalled them. I mean, I really think they would. Now, does that mean they're going to not invite Brett Kavanaugh to lunch when he comes? No, of course not. But that is not how they want to see the court portrayed. But that's where our Republican Party is today.
A few questions ago, you said something about that the election of Kavanaugh would limit government agencies, which would entail less regulation. But wouldn't that just mean that it goes towards the legislature, meaning that the judge and the Supreme Court doesn't get to decide? If so, I mean, I'm assuming that from the talk that we'll do that's bad.
Well, the question is, if Kavanaugh and the court limits regulation from administrative agencies, wouldn't that give power back to Congress? In fact, what it would mean is there'd just be less regulation, is that Congress just doesn't pass that many laws. Congress is an extremely bollocksed up institution.
Isn't that kind of potentially an issue?
Yeah, it's but.
Become the role of the Supreme Court to do something that potentially could be the legislature.
And in fact, actually, I had the opportunity to interview President Obama about the courts when he was in office. And one of the things he said to me was, one of the reasons why, which was, I thought, an interesting insight. He said one of the reasons why the courts are such a focus of controversy today is that the legislature doesn't do its job. Like, for example, if you remember the two Obamacare cases, the first case was about the constitutionality. The second case was about the wording of the law. And it was quite clear that the wording of the law had an unintentional mistake in it. Now, in a period where Congress was functioning, they would have just passed a technical correction to clarify the law. But having passed Obamacare, they certainly weren't going to go back and try to do it again, so that whole controversy was thrust into the courts. So I think in that respect, it is true that the failure of the legislature in particular, to do its job beyond the bare minimum of passing a budget is, it does put pressure on the courts in an unfortunate way. Ask the professor. She's the boss.
Maybe after, just because
Okay,
we're
I'll
kind of
hang
running
around
short
after.
on
Yeah,
time,
yeah.
and I know that there are other hands.
I have the mic here.
Microphone.
Thanks again. Quick question, if I may. Obviously, the Trump era is, in my mind, is a testament for the strength of the systems. Also, the judicial system, the Muslim ban and other administration acts. However, in other jurisdictions, for instance, Israeli jurisdictions, I'm from Israel originally, the courts are very active. Judicial activism was led and is led by very strong personalities that basically are very vocal. And I would say 99% of the stuff that Trump tried to do would be blocked in Israeli courts in 48 hours, whatever the legal basis is. So what I'm asking is your opinion about the future of the courts, because it seems like the composition of the judges, and maybe I'm wrong, it seems to lack of that personality that may be a more vocal point a more vocal voice for the court. And it seems also that the latest decisions are not so intelligent, like Citizens United and the cancellations of the Voting Act. I mean, it's not based on anything.
Well, I wouldn't say it's not based on anything. I mean, I think we are at a very politically polarized moment in our culture, in our politics, in the country as a whole. I mean, Democrats believe one thing, Republicans believe another. That is true in our presidential politics. It's true in the Congress, and it's also true in the courts. that, it used to be that, and as I said at the beginning, that there were moderate Republicans and there were, that's like, what you need to know about the Supreme Court is that there are currently 4 Republican justices and 4 Democratic justices. And in controversial cases, they rule accordingly. I mean, that's sort of, their views are very predictable. So it's not that, the one set of justices is bad and the other is good. They simply reflect the political moment in which we're in, which is very polarized.
Can I?
Yeah.
Sure.
So I'm interested in the October term, which they've set a whole bunch of cases now. And I'm curious, if you look forward rather than at what's going on right at this minute, which of those cases do you see as like ones in which we really should be looking at them? And a lot of them, there's been predictions that a lot of them are very incremental, where there would be incremental kinds of judgments on them.
Wow. You know what? I have not paid a lot of attention to this term yet, and I don't think there are any blockbusters on the agenda just yet. I know the one you argued on Monday. That's big. No, not so big. But and I have not. Their calendar is still being formed for the year. I mean, you can rarely tell on the first Monday in October how big a term is going to be. But at the moment, I don't think there are any blockbusters on the agenda, at least none that I'm aware of.
So we're just going to do one more question, and then
I'll hang around and talk if you want.
How about right back there?
Sure, I can be loud. Do you talk about the stability shown between the justices and hired readers? Do you think that stability can go too far? Because I understand being very civil and respectful towards people who have different political views, but I think when you're talking about people who have very likely sexually assaulted women or sexually harassed in the workplace, that seems different to me. And so I'm wondering if you would comment on.
Do you have anyone in mind? I mean, the question is, should you be civil to people who are credibly accused of sexual assault or sexual harassment? I mean, I get the question, and maybe I'm turning into an old fart, but they're there. They've been confirmed by the Senate. If they have been, they're going to be there a long time. I think the justices are nothing if not politically savvy individuals themselves. They want to win the cases. They don't want to alienate, your friend on. I mean, even though the cases are very polarized usually, you still want to try to gather as many votes as you can. So, casting a colleague off into the darkness because of something that came up it may be self-defeating for for the causes you believe in as a judge. And I think also, one of the things that, is endearing about the court, you spent a year there, is that, they all care deeply about the institution. They really don't want to. It's one reason they have this idiotic failure to put cameras in the courtroom. If there's any court that should have cameras in the courtroom, it's the Supreme Court. But they're worried about changing the dynamics, and I respect that concern, and they want to preserve the institution. So, notwithstanding their personal views about whether their colleague may be a sexual harasser, maybe someone who committed sexual violence, they're going to deal with them as a colleague, I think.
So thank you so much,
Thank
Jeffrey.
you. Thank you.